Here is our procedural PBR bricks material as we left it and looking good, thanks in no small part to our very own UV grid and UV brick nodes. There's nothing to suggest that that which is already good cannot be improved upon, and that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to add some features to the UV brick node which will enhance the variation, endeavoring to eliminate any and all undesirable tiling and repetition of the material when displayed on a larger piece of geometry as opposed to our 1x1 square. The first new feature actually isn't a new feature, it's this little group of nodes, which was our extrusion function, allowing us to force the bricks forward in a uniform way. This is definitely a handy function to have, so why not include this function in the UV brick node itself? First, let's take note of what we actually did with these nodes. We use a fader node, which is essentially a multiply node. We multiply the mask output of our UV brick, and then we add the multiplied result to the height output of our UV brick node right here. So I'll mute these nodes and then reintroduce the function from within the UV brick. But for now, because of the removed extra extrusion here, I should reduce the depth of the mortar a little bit so I can see my bricks clearly and understand better what I'm doing. To recreate the extrusion function within the node, I'll first move my mask up to the top. In every sense, I've actually changed my mind, and I'm going to change the order of these output sockets. I'm going to switch the mask to the top. I'll make a little more room here. And now I'll need a copy of my group input node. I'm going to create the usual slider. Mix RGB, default of 0. And now I'll very simply add the result of my slider directly to my height output. Make a little more space here. Now this function needs a little more work because if you remember outside we multiplied the mask result, and that was to avoid applying the extrusion to the spaces around the bricks where we don't want it. So we have to include the mask in our height output here one way or another. Let's do it at the very end of the chain, meaning that we can apply any kind of height manipulation prior to this math node, which I'll set to multiply. And I can multiply the height result by the mask. And now any manipulations prior to this node will respect the footprint of the brick and will not bleed over into the space surrounding the bricks. I'll make a little more space here because we'll be doing more extrusion work in just a second, but for now, I can now mute these nodes, which previously provided my extrusion. And I should be able to reintroduce my extrusion with my new fact slider, and in fact there it is. And you'll also see that the spaces around the bricks remain unaffected. And we can take this extrusion function a little further. For now it is a uniform extrusion, but there's no reason why we can't apply the same function in a more sloped fashion. For example, instead of applying uniform extrusion all over the face of a brick, I could use a gradient to apply more on one side and less on another. A gradient perfectly suited to that function is the gradient which actually creates the brick itself. And now to introduce these tilt functions, as I'll call them, I need my usual group input node. I need to break apart my input vector, which, if you remember, is the standard output of my UV grid node, standard output down to the UV brick vector right there. So I know that the gradients coming from this separate XYZ node will be from 0 to tile width horizontally and 0 to tile height vertically. Those values I will obtain from here and from here. For these purposes, however, for creating these tilt gradients, I'm going to first normalize the gradients and then multiply the normalized result by a more suitable value, for example, the edge of the brick, which can then be multiplied by any given factor, and that should provide a suitably sized tilt to our bricks. While working from inside a node group, it can be difficult because we can't easily see a preview of what we're working on. The Node Wrangler shortcut Control Shift and left click doesn't work from inside a node group, but what we can do is connect the socket that we want to preview to our group output, creating a new socket which we'll then delete when we no longer need it. And I can preview that new socket from outside the node, just like that. Now I can see what I'm doing. Let me come down here and remove the displacement setup for a second. Now back to my UV brick and my tilt gradients. To normalize the X and the Y components, I'm going to divide them by their respective dimensions. So X gets divided by width and Y will get divided by height when we come to it. Now we have a normalized gradient of 0 to 1 for each individual brick. I'm going to remap this 0 to 1 value to a -1 to 1 value, which we've done a few times before, so you may remember it's accomplished with a multiplication by 2 and a subtraction of 1. Very simple. Now it can be useful to note that by multiplying these gradients by -1, we can flip the sides. Let's consider this brick, for example. This brick is giving us a gradient of -1 here to 1 here. This appears to be all black because you can't represent visually a minus value. A color can only be represented by 0 to 1, 0 being black and 1 being white, if applied evenly to all the channels of the color, obviously. So to change 1 to -1 and -1 to 1, all you have to do is to multiply by -1. You can see the gradients get flipped horizontally as I activate and deactivate this multiply node. So a multiplication of -1 gives me an inverted gradient, and a multiplication of 1 gives me a standard gradient. I could also technically multiply by 0 to eliminate the gradient entirely. So to recreate this functionality of -1 to 1 from the outside of the node so I can control it in such a way, I'm going to create a very familiar slider, but with a small difference. Before we get confused with all our different factor inputs here, let me give them some names. The previous one we created, I'm going to simply call Extrusion. And we'll give this one the name U-tilt, for tilting in the horizontal sense. I no longer need the mix RGB, and the result of this U-tilt socket gets plugged into the bottom of my multiply node. This has made my gradients disappear, as happened before when I entered 0 into this value, and that's because my U-tilt value is in fact 0. I can drag it up to 1, and that reveals my original unaltered gradients again. So a very quick and easy way to reintroduce the -1 to 1 functions is to adjust the possible values from this U-tilt slider right here. Right under the default values, you've got minimum and maximum. For now, I'm set to 0 and 1, which makes perfect sense because I can drag my default value between 0 and 1. So if I set the minimum value to -1, you'll see the slider has jumped to the center point of its track, but its returning value is still 0, which would suggest that I can now drag this slider down, and in fact, there it goes into minus numbers, the ultimate minimum of the slider being -1, and the maximum being +1. I'm going to leave the default of this value at 0, and let's have a look from the outside, and in fact, I can now invert my gradients by sliding this slider back and forth. So that's the horizontal tilt taken care of. Luckily, doing the vertical tilt is just as easy, and I'm going to duplicate all these nodes and then swap X for Y and width for height. I'm going to need to create a new tilt socket exactly like this one, which will obviously be called V-tilt, the usual way. Mix RGB node, default of 0, connect to the new socket and delete. Rename the fact to V-tilt, and move its noodle. There we go. Now we combine our two components with a math node set to add. And now if you remember previously, I talked about multiplying the normalized gradients by the edge input. I'm going to perform that multiplication here after the addition of our two components. Let me duplicate the group input for easy access to my edge input right here. I'll duplicate the math node, drop it onto the noodle, set it to multiply, and hook up my edge input. Finally, I'm going to create one overarching master tilt control for all of the tilt functions with another multiply node. So if I set this to 0, it will remove all tilt in all directions. And if I set it to 1, it will reintroduce all of the tilt in a standard fashion. And it will also allow me to exceed 1 to increase the amount of the tilt if tilting by the value of the edge in any case is not enough. So for now, I'll set this to 1. So when I connect it to the new socket, I get a default of 1. And I'll rename this socket to tilt amount. Now I can reintroduce my U-tilt and flip it horizontally. It's very difficult to see now because I'm actually only getting a numerical output of my edge size, which at this point is 0.008. So as I mentioned before, I can increase the tilt amount. You'll see the gradients get brighter, meaning if this were connected to a displacement output, the displacement would be increased. Let me temporarily set U-tilt to 0 so I can see V-tilt get introduced as I slide my sliders back and forth. However, there's a problem here. I'm only getting 0 to 1, so I have to change my defaults. I'll select the V-tilt socket and simply change the minimum from 0 to -1. And now I can invert my vertical flip gradients just like I did with my horizontals. So with a little luck, we should be done with our preview, but I'm not going to delete this just yet. I'll tab back into the node and remove this noodle from our temporary preview socket so that I can add the result of all my tilt functions here to my height output exactly as I did with my extrusion. So why not? I'll copy the same add node that I used for the extrusion, connect my tilt, and now let's go to the outside of the node and see what we've got. I'm going to set my tilt amount to the default 1 and introduce some horizontal tilt. There we go. We can see that the edges of the bricks are dipping below the mortar. Now clearly to see the protrusion from the surface, I should reintroduce displacement and subdivision. Now when I preview, you can see that the bricks are actually poking forward on the right and sinking into the mortar on the left, which I can flip with my slider. There we go. And I can also turn off by setting the slider to 0. Now let's have a look at the vertical tilt. Our bricks are looking downwards. And now they're looking upwards. To see the result a little more extremely, I'll increase the amount to 3. And now it's very clear what's going on and the results that we're getting. So the functions are now working correctly as we would like, but uniform noise is not noise. We need to make it more random. And as we always do, we obtain any kind of random value we need by separating our random color into its individual channels. And we're going to be using 2 of the channels because we have X and Y or U and V tilt. So we can connect red to U and green to V. However, as always, our colors are in a 0 to 1 range and we have to convert them into -1 to 1 range. So as we did before, and as we will do many, many more times, we multiply by 2 and subtract 1. Plug that into our U-tilt, and there you go. We got some multiply by 2 and subtract 1. There we go. We've got random horizontal tilt applied to each and every brick in varying degrees. You have master control over the tilt right here. Turn it all down. Turn it off entirely. And bring it back in as you see fit. Very cool. Let's do the same for the vertical channel. I'm going to duplicate these nodes. I'll use the green output of my random color, and that goes straight into V-tilt. I'll disconnect the horizontal tilt for a second. There you go. You can see the random tilting going on of the tiles. Some go in one direction, some go in the other, and some don't go at all. Exactly like we wanted. Perfect. As I said before, we will probably need to perform this operation many more times in the future. This is a very common operation, transforming a color, essentially a color, into a vector. A color being in a 0 to 1 range and a vector being in a -1 to 1 range. A vector is not necessarily restricted to -1 to 1, but a color cannot go into the minus values. So let's create a little utility node which can convert 0 to 1 ranges to -1 to 1 ranges for us. We already have the nodes ready to go right here, so I'll select these two, and I'll press Ctrl-G to wrap them up in a node group. And just before I call the node done, I'm going to introduce an intensity control, very simply with a multiply node. If I leave the multiplication set to 1, there is no difference to the result. I can eliminate the result by multiplying by 0, for example, if I want to. So I'll expose this value to the outside of my node. The final thing to do is to give it a name. As I said before, this converts essentially a color into a vector. The thing that a color and a vector have in common is that they have 3 channels. We here are only dealing with 1 channel. So I'm not going to call this node color to vector. I'm going to call this value to direction. And click the shield to keep it forever. Now we can replace our 2 math nodes here with another value to direction node. I'll actually minimize these because we shouldn't need to interact with them anymore. We've got our random tilt in place, and we can control the amount of that tilt with our master tilt amount control, and we're looking good. So at this point, I can rest assured that I won't need to use this temporary preview anymore. So let's come in here, open the end panel, and get rid of it. There we go. Very quickly, let me tidy up these nodes and then we can move on. And that should do nicely. One final check of all our new functions. We can see the random tilt in play. Our extrusion still works. And everything is looking superb. Let's move on. Just before we move on, let me turn the mortar back up ever so slightly and compensate for the drowning of the bricks with a little extrusion. And there we go. That looks good. Okay, next up is the extension and improvement of the variation from brick to brick. So to work on that, I'm going to remove the displacement setup and we'll use an Eevee preview more than anything for viewport responsiveness to make our work as smooth and as quick as possible, essentially. This is what we've got, and our variation is more than enough and more than acceptable as long as we're dealing with a 1x1 plane. But if we start to introduce more geometry, this single texture, which within the bounds of its 0 to 1 UV map is getting moved around and variation is getting introduced, but one way or the other we're still using one texture which begins and ends within these boundaries. So if I repeat this geometry, for example, with an array modifier, I'll move the subsurface to the end of the stack. We have a number of issues to address. First of all, you can see that we're clearly getting an error here, and you'll notice that if I turn off the array modifier, that error is happening where the geometry is joined. That is a UV map issue and can be fixed with these UV offset functions that the array modifier affords us. Let me show you what that actually does. Very quickly, I'll drop in a UV map node here, preview that, break it apart and show you only the X coordinate. You can see that the UV map is getting repeated. If I introduce some more instances with my array modifier, I now have 4 instances or 4 copies of my geometry offset to sit side by side in a line, but they all share the same geometry and they all share the same UV map. You can see that the UV map is the same. I'll illustrate that even further with a greater than node. So I can now sweep along the extent of my 0 to 1 UV map, and you'll see that all the instances do the exact same thing. However, if I turn the U offset, because here I only have U offset in my geometry, I'll turn this up to 1. And now watch what happens when I sweep back and forth with the greater than node. It's no longer 4 separate UV maps. Well, it is more to the point, but the UV maps are now offset in the same way the geometry is offset. And now the geometry functions as if it were one long piece with one single UV map. And that will suit our purposes much better. You'll see that when I go back to a preview, those errors are gone. Here's the edge of my geometry. Let's zoom in really, really close and turn on the array. Not a seam in sight, absolutely perfect. However, back to the point of using essentially one texture for the surface detail of the bricks, there is always going to be repetition. You're always going to see the same detail, which would actually stand out more on the texture, which you would notice more. You'll notice it on the bricks in the same way you would notice it on the texture itself. Let's look for a repeating detail here. Ironically, I'm all of a sudden having trouble finding one, but there's one. There's a repetition of this very recognizable crack shape. And I have a repetition of the same piece of the texture down here. This is not an enormous problem, and if you're only going to be viewing your texture from a distance like this, you don't even have to worry about that kind of thing. But if your textures are going to be viewed from up close, there is a risk that this could be noticeable and you might want to eliminate this. Clearly, you could simply come in and change your random seed. But that is something of a band-aid solution because you could recreate this same problem elsewhere on your material and you just haven't noticed it yet. So what we can do to alleviate the similarities between these repetitions of one area of the texture is to actually perform a function that we've already done in our experiments where we were using a photograph of a person's face. We did flipping and rotating of the individual cells created by our UV grid, and we can do that here. We could take these bricks, for example, and if this brick were flipped upside down, it's true that the texture would still look the same, but this noticeable detail, let's say, being inverted and presenting in a different shape would be much less noticeable to the eye. So let's set about doing that. And we'll accomplish this texture flipping by very simply flipping the texture coordinates that are used to draw that part of the texture. In this case, those coordinates come from our standard vector output. So I'll grab a separate XYZ node and break apart my standard vector. And let's see how we're going to go about doing this flipping. Very simply put, you flip a gradient by subtracting the value of that gradient from its maximum value. In our case, we have 2 gradients to deal with, horizontal and vertical. The maximum value of the horizontal gradient is our tile width, and the maximum value for the Y gradient is going to be the tile height. So let's begin with a math node set to subtract. I'll take the tile width and put it in the top of the subtract, and the X component into the bottom. The gradient is already flipped. It's as easy as that, but now we need a quick and easy way to switch back and forward between our original unflipped gradient and this flipped result right here, which we'll do with a value mix node. And I'm going to plug the original into the top and the altered into the bottom. And now I can blend back and forth between the original and the flipped gradients. This is only one component for now. This is only the X component. I need a complete vector. So I'm going to plug this result into the X input of a combined XYZ node, and I'll take my original unaltered Y from my separate XYZ, plug it into the combine, and now I'll use this to add to my stepped output. So what I essentially have now is my stepped output into this vector math node set to add, and I'm adding this manipulated or flipped version of my standard vector output. I'm going to use this result to substitute my UV map here. Plug that in and let's see what we've got. I'll preview the principled shader. I'll zoom in a little bit and let's see what happens when I move my slider. We get a stretching and then an inverting of the texture exactly like I wanted. Let's have a look at this one in particular. Note this little detail. It now appears on the right. So this is the original unaltered texture coordinate. So originally this dent, this detail would appear on the right. I can flip it to the left with my slider. Very nice. I'm going to need to perform these same manipulations for more components of this vector, so this is going to get a little bit messy, and there will be a few too many nodes. So I'll grab these four, select these four, and wrap them up in a node group. I'll drag this bunch up the top. I'll leave the combine down here to the right, and I will plug the FAC of my mix node into my group input, so I can now flip these textures from the outside. I think it would be a better idea to have a switch function here instead of a gradual change. So I'll drop in the now familiar greater than 0.5, drop it onto the blend noodle right here, and I'll minimize that because I won't need to change it anymore. Now I can switch back and forth between flipped textures and unflipped textures. Let's repeat these operations for the three components of our vector. I'll remove this noodle directly to the Y component. This is no longer useful. I'll turn off the preview because things are broken temporarily. Let's grab these nodes and we'll duplicate them once and twice for the three channels of our vector. The results of the value mix nodes go into the three channels of the combine XYZ. Now we'll swap in the second instance X to Y, and in the third instance X to Z. And now we'll need to change this arrangement here. This value arrangement and FAC arrangement is suitable for our X component. We need the same thing for our Y and Z components. So actually, to simplify things, I'm going to temporarily delete this FAC input. And now I'll simply drag from the new socket to the subtract of my Y component setup. If you see this happen, where you have several group input nodes in your node group, and you create a new socket from one of those group input nodes, as I just did, but the other group input nodes don't actually reflect that change, simply force those nodes to update themselves by dragging a noodle away from any of the input sockets and simply release, and you'll see those nodes get refreshed. So now I can use the new socket to attach to the subtract node of my Z component, as I just did for the other two components. And we're ready to go, but we do need to reintroduce these mix factors. I'm going to use the factor of the value mix nodes so that I get a clamped slider on the outside. So I'll connect from new socket to FAC, new socket to FAC, refresh this one, and again, new socket to factor. Now I'll drop the greater than nodes onto their corresponding noodles. And we're ready to go. That is our node complete. We'll just give the input some names so we know what we're doing. The three values will be called X, Y, and Z size. And suitably X FAC, Y FAC, and can you guess? I bet you guessed right. There we go. So now we have a vector flip node, which is what I've decided to call mine. Vector flip, keep it forever. Turn on my preview and let's see how we're doing. We can now plug in the Y size or the brick height value. Everything else is already connected and ready to go. Z size is irrelevant. We won't be using it. I'll set it to 1 as a type of default. And speaking of defaults, let me actually set those defaults to 1 unanimously. The mix factors can stay at 0. So now I can increase the X slider, flip my textures along the horizontal, and the Y slider to do the same thing for the vertical. However, one more thing to address is the fact that in this PBR setup, we have some normal maps. Now, this flipping of textures won't create any problems for you in any of the other texture maps involved in a PBR setup. The normal map, however, is not a simple color map. The colors contained in a normal map actually represent a direction. So we have to flip those directions in the same way we flip our bricks. More to the point, we actually have to flip the direction of the normal maps as an inverse to the way we flip our bricks, but we don't actually have to worry about that until we address rotating a brick. For now, I'm only flipping horizontally, so I don't need to worry about the inverse. I can perform the same operation to the pixels of the normal map that I perform to these texture coordinates right here. That being the case, I'm going to duplicate this node and drop it onto the color output of my normal map texture node. There'll be no change for now. I'm going to set the X, Y, and Z sizes all to 1. And now I need to make the factor inputs of both of these flip nodes match. Now clearly I could drop in a fader node, 1 for each mix factor, and then connect those 3 fader nodes to this vector flip and this vector flip, but that would create a stark excess of nodes and noodles, and there is a clever little way to get around that. If you need to pass a bunch of information, ideally 3 or less, and you'll see why in just a second, from one node to another, it's not a bad idea to actually collect that information within the node itself, compile it together as a vector with a combine XYZ. You can then pass that vector to the outside of your node and run a single noodle from that node to the next one to pass a bunch of settings to it. Let me show you how to do that. Create a little more space over here, and I'm going to need a duplicate of my group input node. I'm going to plug the X, Y, and Z mix factors directly into my combine XYZ, and I'll give my second vector the name facdata, factor data. Let's move these nodes down here a little bit just for clarity. And now all we have to do is to run our facdata noodle down here, split it apart, and plug it into our factor input sockets right here. I'll use a separate XYZ, plug my facdata into the separate node, hook up X to X, Y to Y, Z to Z. And now these nodes share settings. All I have to do is to change this one, and the other one follows suit. I'll minimize that node just to make it as small as possible. And now let's have a better look at our results. I'm going to remove the albedo contribution to the material to make it a little more obvious of the difference that the normal map is actually making. I'm also going to remove the bump contribution and plug the results of my normal map directly into the principled shader. Now let's have a close look at some indentations. For now, we have highlights on the bottom and shadow on the top. I know that the light in this scene is coming from above, so that suggests to me that this is an indentation, whereas here we have a small protrusion lit on top and shadowed on the bottom. Come over to my flip node, my master flip node, and I'll flip along the X. That looks good. The shadows look correct. Unflip, and now the all-important vertical flip. Excellent. Just what I wanted. Now we've got shadows on top, which was originally the bottom because the texture has been flipped. So our normal map and the directions contained therein are behaving correctly, even when we flip our bricks horizontally or vertically, or both. Clearly the next step is to introduce this flipping in a random way. There isn't really a lot of point in flipping all of the bricks in exactly the same way. Well, there can be. It depends on the use case, I suppose. Hooking up my bump map again, so I have all height maps and normal maps contributing. Let's come back over to the UV grid node, grab a separate RGB node to break apart our random color. And we're going to use 2 channels for the X and the Y factor. Let's plug them straight in. Very, very cool. Some bricks are flipped, some aren't. Horizontal, vertical. Who knows? It's impossible to tell. It gets lost in the ether of the random numbers. But one way or the other, our brick wall is looking pretty darn good. Let's take a look at a subdivided and displaced version, because that is definitely where our extrusion and tilt functions come into their own. Turn on subdivision and we'll see a cycles preview. Very, very nice. Let's come over here and just for the sake of it, let's see what happens if I turn off. By disconnecting the noodles, I'm going to turn off the random flipping. The difference is really very, very subtle. Which sounds like a negative, but it's not. You don't want these manipulations to jump out at you immediately. Very cool. Very, very good. Take out the tilt entirely. Take out the extrusion entirely. I expect my bricks to disappear under the mortar here. In fact, there they go. Tilt everything to the right and everything up. Very good. Okay, we're definitely in good shape. So I'm going to remove the array modifier and turn off subdivision. Go back to an Eevee preview. And the next and possibly last step is to introduce a way to provide different settings every nth row of bricks to the actual UV brick node itself, allowing us to create, for example, different sized bricks, different colored bricks, different offset. Any of the UV brick settings that we choose, we could set them apart and make them different from their preceding bricks based on the number of the row in which they are found. So for example, every 4th row of bricks, we could have the bricks half of the original size, which is actually a very common brick layout. I believe it's called an English layout or an English spread, something similar. And to do that, we'll use, for the first time, I believe, a second UV grid node in one material. And I'm actually going to rearrange things here for a second because I need access to my input nodes. These are the space and edge settings for my UV brick, so I'll move them over here. These are the settings I'm going to need right now. I'll tie together these noodles to make them a little more tidy. Bring my new UV grid node up here. And what I'm going to do is to take the brick height setting and multiply it by a given number. Previously, I mentioned one alternative row every 4 rows of bricks. So I'll multiply my brick height by 4. And I'll provide that to the height setting of my new UV grid node. Let's have a preview of the standard output. I'm not actually using the width setting in this case, so I'm going to set it to a default 1. Turn off offset. And break apart the vector with a separate XYZ node, as we've done many, many times. So here we have a gradient from 0 to tile height multiplied by 4. Now let's say, for example, I want to change the last row. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be the end of my group. I'm only considering this rectangle of bricks right here. And I want to change the bricks in this final row. I'm going to change their settings, their size, their color, etc. So I want to use this gradient, and I need to find a way to isolate a little strip, a little bar of the height of a brick. And I'll do that with a math node set to less than. And if I provide the brick height immediately like this, you'll see that I do in fact get the strip I want of the height I want, but not in the position I want. So let's invert this gradient just like we did before by subtracting it from its maximum value. We know that its maximum value is the same as my height setting right here. So I'll set that to subtract, provide the brick height multiplied by 4, subtract my gradient, and preview the result. I have my inverted gradient just like I wanted, and now I should be able to simply drop on a math node, set to less than brick height, and there we have it. I've got my 4th row mask, and in fact I can also make that into a 5th, 6th, etc. row mask. I can choose as many rows as I want. The only thing to remember is that this number must be an integer. You can't multiply it by 5.5 or you're going to get overlapping of this mask and the edges of the bricks of your texture. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to drop in a temporary color mix node, set it to overlay, turn the mix factor down, and choose something very easy to see. And now I'll use the result of my less than node to drive the mix factor way over here. That certainly sets my bricks apart. Now you'll notice that as I increase this value, decimals are our enemies in this case. So we want integers all the way. So as you're clicking and dragging on this value, remember to hold Control to snap to the nearest integer. Makes life a little easier. So now that we have our mask, we're not going to do anything as simplistic as a simple overlaid color. We'll use this mask to manipulate the brick size numbers that we feed to our UV grid right here. We could do that a number of ways. We could do it with a value mix. We could do it with a multiplication and then blend between the original result and the multiplied result. That's not a bad idea, actually. Let's do it that way. We'll begin with a math node set to multiply by 0.5. And I'll take the original brick width input value and connect it to the top of the multiply node. Make a little more space over here. I'll drop in a value mix node. The unaltered brick width goes into the top and the multiplied goes into the bottom. Now I'll substitute this original brick width setting with my modified setting, allowing me to blend between full brick width and half brick width with my usual very handy slider. Let me just move these nodes over to the right a little bit. I'll bring the reroute with them. And now I can plug in the result of my newly found nth row mask into the mix factor of my value mix. And lo and behold, every 4th row of bricks is now half sized. Change the figures about. Do it every 2 rows. 5, 6, 7, 8. You may notice as I increase these numbers that an alternate row of bricks every even number of rows works out quite nicely in terms of mortar lines and the center point of the brick above or below. If I change this to an odd number, however, you'll see that we get this undesirable matching of mortar lines, which is really not what we want. So just keep this setting to an even number to avoid those unsightly matching mortar lines. Let's come over here to the texture set, which provides the brick surface. And we can do a little color manipulation with a hue saturation node. I'll drop it onto the result of the albedo texture node. And now I'll connect the result of my nth row mask to the FAC control of the hue saturation value node. Turn up the saturation, change the hue, change the value. And at this point, we most definitely have a very clear separation of every nth row of bricks. To see the material in all its glory one last time, let's hook up a displacement setup and see what we've got. And with that, we have completed a procedural PBR bricks material with so many functions I can't even remember them all. As a matter of fact, let me go to an Eevee preview to show you all these differences in a much more responsive way. Let's take a quick tour of the various settings of our procedural material. We can change the width of the bricks, the height of the bricks. We can change the number of alternative rows of bricks. We can change the offset. We can change the mortar size. We can change the size of the edge of each brick and the style of that edge, making it sharp or soft, the same for our corners. We've got surface noise size controls here. Speaking of size controls in extrusion, we have our extrusion setting right here. We have our tilt controls. Is there anything I've forgotten? Oh yes, we have random. It's so subtle that I don't even notice it anymore. We have random flipping up and down and left and right of bricks to set them apart from their brothers and sisters. And with so many features, nearly endless combinations must be possible. And the possibility to swap out the texture sets means that really with this, you can achieve just about any kind of tile or brick setup that you want to get your hands on. Let's try something a little bit different. I'm not going to swap out the textures just because of time. But I'll reduce the space, I'll reduce the edge size. I'm going to plug the tilt back in, but I'll reduce the amount of tilt. I'll reduce the extrusion to 0 and the mortar height also to 0. Come over here and make my sizes more square. And I'll remove the offset to create a very different style of tile, pardon the rhyme scheme. I'm going to increase my mortar space a little more, or grout space, I suppose, in this case, because at this point we're building tiles rather than bricks by the look of it. I need more mortar, and as a result, I need more extrusion. Let's increase the size of the edge. Turn on the softness and the round corners. Let's try another little thing really quick. A very different type of result from this material just by changing the settings and going back to a displacement setup. Have a look at this. I'll set the sizes significantly smaller, and I'm going to set the edge size to half of my tile size, which was 0.06. So over here, I'll enter 0.03. Oh, sorry, that's the space. That won't do. Let's put that back down to 0. 0.03 for my edge. I got some sphere type things going on. Let's eliminate the nth row alternative bricks function by turning it off with a fader to literally fade the effect. There we go. I'll reintroduce the offset of 0.5. I'm going to reduce the extrusion and increase the tilt amount. And we're getting something that looks an awful lot like cobblestones. Turning it up. And the final touch, which is my favorite part, reintroduce the mortar, bury them in sand, and then reveal them again. As I said, almost any kind of tiling texture you can think of. Bathroom tiles, floor tiles, wall bricks, cobblestone floors. The possibilities are nigh on endless. And a pretty impressive node tree as well. And that'll do it for this video and for this material. It has come a long way and we leave it in a good place. But next time it's onwards and upwards to something somewhat similar, but undoubtedly different. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. And if you found it useful, please consider subscribing for other video content like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.